Okay, it is 7:02, so I think we will make a start then. Welcome everyone in the audience tonight to this Cardiff Book Talk event on Anne Quin and her novel Passages. So just to remind you, if you didn't hear what I was saying at the beginning, you can use the chat function to say hello if you want to. You can use the Q&A button later on in the event to post your questions to put to our panelists following their talks, but you can post the questions at any time you wish. At Cardiff Book Talk, we have a number of other online events forthcoming, and I'll talk more about those at the end. But do go to our website, cardiffbooktalk.org, to see more information, not just about more events like this, but also information about our speakers and their amazing work on Anne Quin. I'm going to hand over to our chair for this evening, who is Nonia Williams. So I'll just introduce Nonia, and then she will introduce the novel and our panelists tonight and begin the discussion. Nonia Williams is a lecturer in literature at the University of East Anglia, where she finished her PhD on Anne Quin in 2013. She works on experimental writing, representations of gender, madness and aging, and archives. Her writing has mainly focused on Anne Quin and Doris Lessing, though she has not yet written about them both together. With Kay Mitchell, Nonia co-edited the Edinburgh University Press collection British Avant-Garde Fiction of the 1960s. This book includes essays on more than a dozen avant-garde British writers of the 1960s, including Anne Quin, and shows this to be a crucial period of British literary history. In her wider work, Nonia is an academic curator of the Doris Lessing Archive at the University of East Anglia and co-editor of English, the Journal of the English Association with Oxford University Press. At the moment, she is editing a special issue of essays on Quin for Women, a Cultural Review, and is also writing her own book on Quin too. So thank you for being one of our expert speakers here tonight on Nonia. And I'll hand over to you now to introduce the book and the panel. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks also to the Book Talk team for inviting me to come this evening. I'm really looking forward to hearing from both our panellists. And I just wanted to introduce the book a little bit for those of you who may or may not be familiar with it before we hear Josh and Arwa speaking on it. So I'm, okay, so here we go. Just going to share my screen. So when I began working on Anne Quin in 2008, she was a very little known British avant-garde writer. Thankfully, in recent years, there's been an increased interest in Quin's work, and the Gorgeous and Other Stories reissues of her novels. So far, and Other Stories have reissued her novels Berg, 3, and most recently Passages, only a month or so ago, as well as previously uncollected works in The Unmapped Country. These reissues are a great testament to this renaissance of Quin's work, and also all of the reissues have introductions by contemporary writers. And so Quin is kind of being framed as a writer who speaks to our contemporary moment in these books in a really interesting way, I think. Quin was born in Brighton in 1936 and died off the coast at Shoreham-on-Sea in 1973. For much of her adult life, she lived in London, and during the early 60s, she travelled to Ireland, Italy, Paris, Amsterdam, and Scotland. Her first experimental novel, Berg, was published in 1964 and was hailed by reviewers as murkily original and menacing, promising a talent likely to develop in strength. And it won her the Harkness and D.H. Lawrence Fellowships, which enabled her to travel, live and work in the US and New Mexico for several years in the mid to late 1960s. Her third novel, Passages, published in 1969, was written while Quin was living in America, but is very probably set in Greece. In the summer of 1964, Quin had travelled across Italy and the Ionian Sea, and then in Parga, Athens, Corfu, Ithaca, and Kolymos. I mention Quin's peripatetic life because Passages is a novel whose form and content are always in transit. This journeying leads towards an endpoint or a resolution that is always absent and deferred. Its storyline follows a woman and man's quest across a Mediterranean landscape. The man is her lover, and their sexual relationship is marked with anxiety, violence, and voyeurism. The woman's search is an external one as she seeks for her lost brother. The man's search seems to be more internal, more of a search for self. In both its form and content, Passages is interested in the process of the journey and quest rather than its outcome. The brother or a clear sense of self is never found, and the metaphor of the journey is made over into the very substance and form of the book itself. The book is divided into 4 sections, which shift alternately between 2 perspectives, broadly those of the woman and the man. Her narrative is largely an impressionistic account of the sensory experiences along the way. His is an annotated journal. The narrative perspective in the women's sections, and I've included an example here, so to sort of show you how it looks on the page, in terms of the sort of series of paragraphs and part paragraphs. And the narrative perspective in the women's sections slip between first and third person. Their narrative form is a series of transitional passages that are not quite paragraphs often, which are often incomplete and broken off mid-sentence to be continued in the passage below. This episodic form creates a sort of stasis and momentum, a stop-start from one arbitrary place or point in the narrative to another. In contrast, the man's journal sections do not so much narrate the passing of time as they cross and mediate between different viewpoints and ideas. We have notes, reported speech, recorded dreams, cut-up techniques, sections taken from source material, and diary entries, which are placed in parallel, side by side in columns on the page. The result is that various types of text are co-present, and sometimes without clear connection. Such a layout means that a coherent, stable narrative perspective is denied, as well as a familiar reading action. Instead, the eye must track back and forth between the columns of text to try to work out possible relationships between them, while the very format of placing text side by side means that the possibilities for multiple meanings are always very explicitly present in the layout. The various narrative forms of passages play out a tension between readability and ambiguity, specifically in terms of narrative sequencing, but also in shifting narrative perspectives. These move alternately between the woman and the man, between first person and third person, interior and exterior spaces, lucid impressions and observations on the one hand, and suggestive or enigmatic juxtapositions on the other, between sexual subject and object, fantasy and reality. Throughout, the shifting impressions, preoccupations, fragments, and parts of the novel are held together by Quin's intense and lyrical prose, and by patterns, resonances, echoes, and connections. The resulting composition creates an immersive, enigmatic, complex, startling, and moving novel. And in several of its reviews, it's referred to as a novel that sort of feels like a musical composition. So until now, I've been introducing the book to you by showing you images of it and by describing its form and its content. But it seems to me that really the best way to give everyone a sense of the texture and patterns of the writing in passages is to read Quin's own words from the first couple of the pages of the book. And I thought it would be really nice to have Quin's voice, her words, directly in the room. So I'm going to read to you from the first couple of pages now, and I haven't put them up on screen for you to read alongside, because what I want to introduce you to is this sense of sort of texture and rhythm of the prose. So I'll begin. Not that I've dismissed the possibility my brother is dead. We have discussed what is possible, what is not. They say there's every chance. No chance at all. Over 1,000 displaced persons in these parts, perhaps more. So we move on, towards, away, claiming another to take his place as I place him in profile, shapes suiting my fancy, rooms with or without connecting doors. He watches when she isn't around, a perverse protection he knows she needs. From his need, he takes notes for a book, journal, report in some hotel. I no longer question. Parts of him I want to know, others he tells me of, trips he has made here before, the sea, fruit, dry riverbeds, beds slept in, not slept in, back from islands, concrete islands, barren, cultivated, sunlight before the rain, violence of day by day these thoughts, stirs fingers onto insects at night, their mark on white walls, her head rolling in afternoon sleep. As in the half-dark room, he listened to music. I listened to sounds, waited for those that never came. I didn't look up. Their bodies rotated, she above, legs, arms moved with the music over him. On the floor, the bed, they made a tent of the sheet, light in parts of skin. Movement so near, by stretching my hand into the open, I heard cicadas, wind colliding with trees, sounding an ocean in the long room. I opened the shutters. Town huddled above the sea, thin shadows of cypresses. She stood over him. He pushed her down onto her knees. I drew the curtains. I couldn't see, but saw what next would happen. I was thirsty. Water heavy with smoke, heat, a bitter taste, hardness of the glass. She saw herself in. Buzz, buzz, buzzing of a mosquito round the candle. Wax-formed green rivers, frozen. I tried lifting him from the floor, laughter, afterwards recognised as my own. The sea, a faint white line, a longing for rain. Olives dried in the sun, no longer sensations. Grapes, whiter from dust. Sand, shaken in water. Seaweed he put round the bed, when my hair, neck, were no longer part of the seaweed. Sun behind rocks, shadow columns from fig trees where I slept. Woke up hanging over the bed. In the next room, I pictured her smile. Larger it seemed than the face could hold. She held his head. He in a praying position, about to throw up. He moved between mirrors, measured the two rooms, appeared naked on the balcony. Ah, here you are. I wondered where you had got to. He turned away, murmuring, heat so unbearable, if only it wasn't so dry, if only it would rain. He gestured as if opening the sky, split in half. He turned the air conditioner up. We drank small cups of black coffee, thick, sweet, and sucked halva, bread from an oven, in another part of the house. A spiral stairway he went down. She looked in the round mirror, walls of mirrors, circles of water, trees, faces edged off by shifting light. He rubbed an oblong stone. A fig opened slowly, lips thin, eyes narrowed on the deeper textures. Moments flashed, yellow, blue, orange. Sky so blue startles the eyes. Lying down, I no longer saw the sea, land a desert. Gulls, paper wet, screamed. She looked for her brother against marble, steel railings, entrance halls, hotels. A museum, I remember, where I came across his signature that perhaps wasn't there at all. Okay. And so with Quin's words in the air, I'm going to turn now to introduce you to our first speaker, of this evening. So our first speaker is Arwa Al-Mubaddel, and Arwa's talk title is Shapes Suiting Her Fancy, Visual Narrative and Cinematic Vision in Anne Quin's Passages. Arwa is a PhD researcher in critical and cultural theory at Cardiff University, where she is exploring metamodernism, metafeminism, and feminine subjectivity in British women's writing. Arwa obtained her MA degree in English literature with a concentration in women and gender studies from Rutgers University, where she also received the department's highest distinction in literary studies award. She has also written a chapter on the role of Vivian Eliot in the shaping of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in Thanks for Typing, Remembering Forgotten Women in History, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2021. Additionally, she is co-chair of the Modern and Contemporary Postgraduate Research Network, based at the School of English, Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff University. So over to you, Arwa.
Thank you for the introduction, Nania, and for that great introduction. As Nania mentioned, my paper will be looking at the visual narrative and cinematic vision in Quin's passages. I will give a brief outline of the talk. So first, I will introduce what I mean by visual narrative and cinematic vision. My talk is divided into two parts. So part one looks at the visual aspect of the text, and in it, I analyze the woman's narrative and man's narrative as visual texts in reference to two paintings, the early Renaissance, The Birth of Venus, and the more contemporary Eurydice, number 2, by Braque Ettinger. In part two, I look at the cinematic vision in the text. So I look at kinetic movement. I also look at narrative angles and perspectives and the parallels the text has to Maya Deren's Meshes in the Afternoon. To begin with, visual narratives are narratives that place images and drawings on an equal standing with written and spoken language. And the most frequent method of studying visual narrative is through shape and form. So the structure of a narrative or a text contributes to its meaning. Examples of visual narrative includes comic books, graphic novels, and visual poetry. By cinematic vision, it is the way a story shows itself rather than tells actions and events and characters. So when an author uses visual techniques that reflect a cinematic dimension, you have zooming in and out on a scene, capturing the kinetic movement of a text the way that a camera would. And here, this little poem is a tree. So this is an example of a visual narrative in its most basic form. So this is a poem about a tree, and the form reflects the meaning as well. Now, when it comes to visual narrative in passages, as Nania mentioned, that can be seen from the woman's narrative through its movement. So here we have wave-like movements in the text. In this paragraph on page number 7, you have the end of the paragraph beginning with, ending with always he was there, the blonde hairs, the slender. And then you have this gap, this empty white space. And the next paragraph continues with shadows of almond trees. So here you have an ellipses and a gap. So this shows an interruption in thought. It shows fluctuation, but it also represents the wave-like movement of the woman's text. So with the second line of the second paragraph, you have reference to this movement, a thin line of the incoming tide be walked along. So as you see, these sentences are not complete. There's lots of fluctuations, and meaning here is more associative than concerned with syntax and grammar and full sentences, because it reflects the woman's own movement. With the man's narrative, we have a very different kind of visual layout. So here we have journal entries and annotations or side notes to them. And this reflects the control that the male narrator wants to have over the narrative. So he thinks a lot about forms, so forms forming themselves. And then he acts like a sculpture. So he describes the woman as a surface of marble, which he slowly begins to cut other shapes from. So the text and the woman are both related. And in trying to control the woman, he also tries to control the story about her. So in this example, you see him trying to sculpt her, trying to define her as a femme fatale, teasing, flirtatious, quick, witty, mysterious smiles. So you see this kind of rigid, linear, and divisive thinking. And this is related to his male ego and his attempt to control both the woman and text. Now, when it comes to the representation of the woman in passages, there's a lot of visual imagery and symbolism that she is captured through, especially through the man's narrative. So here I evoke the painting, The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. This is an early Renaissance painting, and I refer to it because it represents the ideal feminine. It's a painting of Venus, the goddess Venus, also known as Aphrodite, and she's considered to be the origin of woman. So here in this painting, you see an aesthetic representation. Venus here is fully fleshed. She stands tall. She's carried by a seashell. And then you have a very pleasant spring background. You have flowers being flung at her. And you have her mute and downcast and looking towards the sea. So here the man looks at the woman as an emblem of the feminine. And here in these examples, he sees her as a Venus-like figure. So she returns each morning just after the sun has risen, bathed in smoothness from the sea. The oracle of her ear felt fresh, cool, a shell to the touch on the tongue. So here the shell is reference to Venus, who is carried by a shell, and the woman's connection to the sea is also connected to this representation. And then the woman speaks of herself as having seaweed in her hair. And to that, the man comments, "You are very beautiful, but like a legend." So here I see this legend as being a reference to Venus. And in a way, the man mythologizes the woman. So he's not able to see her for who she truly is. Instead, he sees her in terms of the mythological side notes that he attaches to his journal entries. And then there is this grotesque element as well in the representation of the woman in passages, because here seaweed represents the grotesque. It is something disgusting to the male narrator. He finds it repugnant. And on page 54, he describes how the trail of seaweed after the tide has turned, and this invokes in him a sense of panic. And then the woman is also represented as an amphibian-like figure. So she assumes a grotesque shape, according to the man, because she spends a lot of time in the water. And on page 51, he describes grotesque shapes appearing, crawling towards him. And then going back to the painting, we also have the symbolism of flowers. So we have the man giving the woman flowers, but these flowers are artificial. So on page 47, he writes that he bought her some flowers, the same color, the plastic wax kind they put on graves. But these flowers are artificial, so they lack a natural element, whereas the woman in one instance in the narrative scatters flowers around the male narrator, but he throws them across the balcony, and he asks her if she can hear sirens. So he's still preoccupied with this mythological sculpting of the woman. Now, in contrast to the birth of Venus, I present another painting which is more representative of the woman's subjectivity. Here we have Eurydice #2, and this is a psychological painting by Braca Ettinger that shows feminine traces and outlines dispersing. So these are one person and several at the same time. And this captures the woman's movement and also her fluctuation. And then also Ettinger's process involves a lot of cutting up and tracing and photocopying. So her technique in this painting is similar to Quin's technique, her narrative technique in passages. So here I have two examples of how Quin presents us with images that she adds on to in each different instance. So for the first one, we have an image of the woman with seaweed in her hair. And then the second instance, we have pieces of melon, skin around the woman's nails. And then in the third instance, we have the woman having agency in picking up a cantaloupe. And the image is complete when she returns at sunrise and offers the male narrator some melon. So this is dispersed across the text, but looking at these images together, it gives you a full painting, a full picture of what actually is happening. And that helps us understand the fragmentation of the text. In another instance in the man's narrative, he describes Medusa entering his room, and you can guess that Medusa here is the woman because he likes to mythologize her. And then he describes her entering a room that opened out onto the balcony. So here you have the same core image, but you have textual layering and additions to it. And then finally, the woman describes her face as being landscaped. So it's stretched across the landscape and also across a psychological space, much like the painting here we have by Braca Ettinger. Now moving on to part 2, which has to do with the cinematic vision of passages. So the most obvious aspect of cinematic vision is the kinetic movement. So you can imagine the movement of the woman and the man throughout the novel as if a camera was following them. So we move on towards away. We move from hotel to taxi, from taxi to train. She came to the edge, jumped into the expanding blueness. She would pace the room. So you have lots of kinetic movement and kinetic energy that is similar to what you see in films. And then you also have a variety of narrative angles and positions. So here is an instance where the man has photo negatives and he starts to process them. And he shows us the kind of snapshots that he takes through the camera. So here you have distinct separate images. You have the girl, you have gardens, the spiral staircase, a car parked outside a government building. And so bubbles of the sea, a photo taken from the helicopter of the watchtower, and so on. So here you have many images that are reflected throughout the narrative in the same way that a camera takes photos. And you also have this aerial vision of photos being taken from a helicopter or a watchtower. So this is called an aerial shot, and this is something that you also see in films to give an overview of the film. Now here I look at the parallels between Quin's passages and Meshes in the Afternoon. So with Meshes in the Afternoon, you have many similarities with Passages, especially in terms of plot and structure. So both Maya Deren and Anne Quin were independent in their craft. Maya Deren did her own thing just as Anne Quin did. And her Meshes in the Afternoon was independently produced, and it is quite experimental. It tells the story of a hazy, dreamlike sequence of a woman who repeatedly chases after a robed figure. Like Passages, it also has a non-linear narrative. It has repeated shot sequences and symbols. And then you also have the camera moving in many different angles. Here are stills from the film, so I will go through them very quickly just to show the parallels and the connections this has with Passages. So here you see the woman moving and running and going through doors and staircases. Here you have a close-up of the woman's eye. In one instance in Passages, you have this attention to the wrinkles on the face, to the features on the face, and other close-ups in the text. You also have shapes and angles, and this is similar to narrative positions and angles in Passages. So this is what you call a Dutch camera tilt, and this is where the camera is slanted, so it shows you the frustration or confusion or fear of the scene. And here we have these angles repeated quite often in the film. We also have a hazy filter on one of the windows as the woman looks out, and being a dream sequence, it has similarities to Passages because there is a lot of haziness in Passages as well. So here the woman describes before sleep, after sleep, in dreams. The dream settles into spaces, divided walls, doors opened out to the sky. And here this image from Meshes reflects that. And then we also have a still of the main character, the woman in Meshes, sinking into this veil or shadow, which is here represented by a piece of cloth. And this is similar to the woman shrinking into her own shadow and leaning there. That part I entered where I returned. We also have mirrors and reflections in both the film and Passages. So the male narrator moves between mirrors. He's very fond of them. He likes to have an ornate mirror on the wall opposite of his bed. And he also occupies this position of a persona that he disconnects from himself. So he wore a mask. So he wears a mask and sees things behind it. And then we have other symbols that you can see. For instance, the seashell here is also reflected by the mirror. You have the woman in Meshes flinging herself over the bed, much like the woman in Passages. You have representations of flowers. You have the robed male figure. And this robed male figure also reflects the male narrator in Passages who describes himself as a high priest. And he mentions that he's able to occupy the woman's mind and control her perceptions. And then we have this dissociation of the woman where she sees herself from behind a window pane, also reflected in Meshes, where we have the main character observing herself from behind a window. We also have two other instances where the woman sees herself from afar, and this is similar to Passages as well, as the woman is able to step out of herself and observe her past and her future self. And then finally, we have also the occurrence of seaweed. So in Passages, it begins with the man putting seaweed around the bed of the woman, around her hair and neck. And here seaweed incorporates feelings of horror and disgust. And the ending of Meshes in the Afternoon, we have an image of the woman dead lying on the couch in her living room with seaweed in her hair. And then finally, both passages and meshes mesh with the sea. So they do bring in the sea as a symbol of both women's subjectivity and fluidity that is represented in the fluctuation of both the film and text. And finally, I'd like to end with this quote by Quin. Is it her body I hold in my arms or the sea? And this describes how difficult it is for the male characters in both the film and the novel to pin down the subjectivities of both women. And with that, I end my speech. I apologize for going a little bit over, but back to you, Nanya.
Thank you so much, Arwa. That was fascinating. I was hastily scribbling loads of notes, loads of really interesting ideas and images there. Really great to see those images. Thank you. So I'd just introduce our next speaker now. So our next speaker, Josh Powell. Josh's talk title is Anne Quin's Passages and the Literature of Depersonalisation. Josh is a lecturer in the English Literature Department at Cardiff University. His doctoral thesis focused on Samuel Beckett's relationship with experimental psychology, and a monograph based on this project was published in 2020 as part of Bloomsbury's Historicising Modernism series. He has published articles in the Journal of Beckett Studies, the Journal of Literature and Science, and Philip Roth Studies. His latest article, which focuses on the writing of Anne Quin, came out last year in Textual Practice. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Nanya, and thanks everyone for putting this together. It's really great to get this chance to talk about Quin for an extended period of time. I'm just going to try and navigate this and share my screen, and then I'll get started. Okay, all right, so what I'm going to do today is basically introduce the project I'm trying to work on at the moment. It basically is an attempt to sketch out a tradition of the way the experience of depersonalization has been represented in literature over the last kind of 150 years or so, I would say. And Anne Quin is quite a big part of this way of representing depersonalization, I think. So I'll just first kind of give a sense of what depersonalization is, because when I say I'm working on depersonalization, people tend to squint at me and ask me what it means. So I'll just give a sense of it. So it's basically a dissociative experience in which an individual feels unreal or cut off from their mind, body, or surroundings or individuality. A good way of describing it is you kind of feel like your first person perspective somehow detaches itself from your body or your individuality and starts kind of watching your performance at a distance, I suppose. It's an experience that is medicalized, but it is a common experience as well for a lot of people. It's sometimes associated with a loss of emotional reactivity. If you feel like your kind of individual identity or sense of subjectivity is detached from your person, it kind of makes sense that you feel like this kind of emotional numbness. I think lots of people who experience depersonalization frequently speak of it. And those experiencing depersonalization in the long term, in kind of severe terms, and experiencing it negatively, it's not always experienced negatively, are diagnosed at the moment with depersonalization disorder or DPD. But there's been some debate in psychiatry over the last century or so, really, about whether depersonalization is a kind of thing in itself, a condition in and of itself, or whether it should be seen as a symptom of other conditions like sometimes depression, sometimes schizophrenia. It seems quite to be part of a lot of different conditions that kind of seem quite different from each other. So there's some debate about that, but at the moment it's really being focused on as a disorder, that's kind of treated as something people kind of identify as having. But it's not necessarily a medical experience, and it's not necessarily medicalized. It can certainly occur in healthy individuals, particularly during fatigue, meditation, extreme stress, or after use of psychotropic drugs. I think it can occur when you're writing as well, writing fiction, and particularly kind of autobiographical work. So I think many people, and most people probably listening, will have experienced some kind of depersonalization. I know I have. And the concept has really been in psychology and psychiatry, particularly for a very long time. It's been kind of debated and studied in the psychological psychiatric journals since the kind of 1850s, 1860s, really. But knowledge of it as a term hasn't really reached a wider audience. A 2015 Guardian article called it the condition you've never heard of that affects millions. That's DPD, depersonalization disorder. So the Guardian kind of is well known enough to be focused upon in an article in the Guardian, but not well known enough for the Guardian to assume that its readers will have heard of it. So it is kind of around, and it has been increasingly studied over the last 10 years, I would say. And the term was brought into psychiatry by Ludovic Dugas in the middle 19th century, and it's really from him that we get our get the term depersonalization, and that depersonalization as a disorder is studied. So what my current project wants to do is kind of acknowledge that there's this big discourse of depersonalization in psychiatry and psychology. And I'm trying to sketch a literary tradition or a series of literary texts, but also engage with these experiences of depersonalization, or represent these experiences, and also think about the way in which the literary representation and literary accounts, the literary constructions of depersonalization kind of intersect with the medico-scientific one that's probably more well established, as I would say. There's probably a kind of obvious starting point with this. Certainly it seemed obvious to me, because Ludovic Dugas, who began this discourse of depersonalization in the 1800s, really he took this term from a literary text, really, or from a literary writer. That writer's Henri Frederick Emile, and the text is Emile's published diary, the journal on Team. Emile's not that well known, but the journal is quite famous. But he was a kind of middling poet, scholar, essayist, but is most famous for these kind of talking about himself. Really, he liked to talk about himself a lot in this journal, and he really described the experience of depersonalization in a way that a lot of psychiatrists and early psychiatrists found suggestive, I suppose. And this is in front of you is the kind of canonical account of it that Emile gives, and I'll just read it now. I find myself regarding existence as though from beyond the tomb, from another world. All is strange to me. I am, as it were, outside my own body and individuality. I am depersonalized, detached, cut adrift. So this process of regarding yourself or observing yourself as outside of your own body or your own individuality, and feeling just cut adrift from yourself and your surroundings. And Emile constructs this, and psychiatrists kind of jumped on it and picked up on it, really. So it became important in psychiatry, but I think it also kind of was brought into Anglophone literature, and this was done through, I think, most notably the translator of Emile's journal, the one who translated it into English. That's Mary Augusta Ward, who some people may have heard of. she was a fairly prominent literary figure within the late 19th century, and is probably best known for a quite controversial and highly popular novel called Robert Elsmere. So it was a controversial novel mainly because it really represented a protagonist's loss of religious faith, a religious figure losing faith in constructing a kind of alternative religion which didn't really believe in God effectively. And it was very, very controversial in Britain, and was one of the best-selling works of the 19th century, I believe, of the late 19th century anyway. So it's famous for that, but it also gives us this kind of narrative of depersonalization through the character of Edward Langham, who is pretty well thought to have been based on Henri Frederick Emile and the depiction of Henri Frederick Emile that Mary Augusta Ward got through translating the diary. Langham is a kind of Lothario figure, really. He's a bit of a decadent, kind of doesn't have belief in really anything, and over the course of the story, he kind of accidentally almost falls in love with the protagonist's sister-in-law Rose, and kind of falls in love, makes this promise to marry her, and then backs away after realizing he's not able to live authentically in the world and be part of society. And in this passage of the novel, we're seeing him explain his situation. He says to Rose, "Between others and me, there is a great gulf fixed. I watch them pass, and I say to myself, there are the living. That is how they look, how they speak. Realize once for all, but you have nothing to do with them. Life is theirs, belongs to them. You are already outside it. Go your way and be a spectre among the active and happy no longer." So I think it seems pretty clear to me that we've got a account of Emile's depersonalized experience here. The same kinds of language of externality and detachment, and where Emile says he's watching life from beyond the tomb, Langham conceptualizes himself as a spectre. So this experience is moving its way from Emile not only into psychiatry but also into fairly popular literature. And I'm only really doing the preliminary research on this, but I've got a sense that these experiences become pretty interesting and pretty prominent within 19th century literary culture and late 19th century literary culture. I've got a feeling they find their way into things like Oscar Wilde's work, perhaps. Wilde notably read Emile's translated version of Ward's translated version of Robert Elsmere and of Emile's journal, and didn't really like it and gave this kind of scathing review. And I get the feeling that there's a trajectory from Langham to someone like Dorian Gray in the picture of Dorian Gray. So I think there is this tradition, this literary tradition, that starts in the late 19th century of depersonalization. In my project, what I want to do is effectively trace how this literary interest of the late 19th century develops into the 20th century and beyond, and continues to intersect with the medico-scientific discourse. And I think Quin's work is really pretty crucial to this. I think it's going to have a really prominent place in thinking about this. Quin's an interesting character because she clearly had quite a good knowledge, from what I can tell, of the history of psychiatry. Historic psychiatrists from the 19th century and beyond seem to come up in a lot of her work, particularly the later work. And she obviously had experience of psychiatric treatment and mental ill health, and I think those experiences are definitely informing of her representation of depersonalization. If we think about the concept of depersonalization itself, I suspect she became aware of it. I'm not exactly sure when. I need to do a bit of the research on that, but Seems he became aware of it through 1960s object relations psychoanalysis, which used that term quite a bit. The dates of exactly when she read what a little bit sketchy for me, at least at this point. But regardless of what she read, the experience of depersonalization is pretty common in Anne Quin's work, and Passages is no exception. I think there's a formal aspect to that, a formal aspect to this, and there's a number of things you could point to here. I think the way, as a few people have noted, the way in which the perspectives shift in this quite disorientating way in Passages is part of this. These abrupt shifts from the first to the third person, which are observable from the outset of the story. I think that's definitely part of it. And I think Arwa's idea of how this kind of works in cinematic in films is really interesting there. So I think that aspect is something you could explore. But for here, I want to focus on a more clear account of depersonalization, or depersonalized experience, or what resembles depersonalized experience that comes towards the end of Passages. So I think, this kind of medical, scientifico-medical approach to depersonalization becomes obvious in this final section, which is the journal of the unnamed male protagonist. He gives this account just right towards the end of the novel. He says, "How many hours I waste lying in bed thinking about getting up. I see myself go out, move, drink, eat, smile, pay attention, talk, go up, go down. I am absent from that part, yet participating at the same time. A voyeur in all senses, in my actions, non-actions. What a delight it might be actually to get up without thinking, and then when dressed, look back and still see myself curled up fast asleep under the blankets." So we've got this common experience that's running through the quotes I think I'm giving now. It's this experience of detachment and voyeurism of the self, really, of watching yourself with this detachment, the first person perspective, kind of escaping out of the body of the individual and observing it with this kind of uncomfortable feeling of detachment. In this case, we've got a more shifting perspective. That the narrator seems to be at first imagining the potential actions he might do when he's lying in bed, and there's often this feeling in the journal and in these male figure passages, particularly, of not knowing whether something's being imagined and watched. The self is watching something doing an imaginary action, or watching the self is watching itself doing something actual. And he seems to say towards the middle of this passage that a lot of the time when he's carrying out actions, he's not feeling present to them. He's a voyeur to his actions and his non-actions. So really observing from himself from a distance as the third person. So I think there's clear links, and part of what I'm trying to do is really think about the differences, different way in which Quin constructs what I think is depersonalized experience in contrast to some of the earlier texts. But what I'm also trying to do is really place these experiences of depersonalization as they appear in literary writing into larger social narratives, I think, larger historical narratives. And I've just picked out a few themes that I'm really trying to get at through this reading, and I think they're things we can. I think approaching Quin through depersonalization can help us get at some of these things, but at the fringes of Passages. So the first is secularization. We have this concern in Emile. Emile's worry about his depersonalization is always linked to a wider concern about a loss of faith, and a wider social concern about a loss of religion in society and what this is doing to the self. This is picked up by Ward, obviously, whose protagonists is concerned with a loss of faith and a breakdown of faith. And there's a sense that Robert Ellesmere's loss of orthodox religious faith will lead to him to turn into someone like Langham, who is the kind of unlikable figure of the story. He's seen as the kind of the dire consequences of a loss of religious faith, I think. And this allows us to see the role of religion and secularization in Quin's protagonist. It certainly made me notice the way in which this male protagonist is concerned with secularization and particularly his Jewish identity, I think. And I've always wondered why this Jewish identity is there. I think that might be, looking at it through this larger history of secularization might be a way of going about that. I think the other aspect I really want to consider is this sense of a critique, I suppose, or a moralization of modern masculinity, I suppose. Emile is very concerned with this depersonalization. These depersonalized experiences are taking away his ability to act with agency, with moral agency in the world. And this again seems to be a concern with Ellesmere. And I think Quin is an interesting development on this. Quin obviously has a less kind of anxious moral tone, I would say, but we're obviously dealing with some pretty kind of dangerous moral questions when we're considering the masculine figure in this story. So I think thinking about Quin's kind of the way in which depersonalization is associated with a degree of immorality, and particularly sexual immorality, is probably worth considering. And finally, just to finish, the last point I'm really concerned with is the form of the diary in general, because the journal seems to have this major influence on the psychiatric discourse. It seems to emerge out of Emile's journal on Team, and in, say, contemporary approaches to depersonalization disorder, the diary plays a pretty central role in keeping journals of this experience, putting it into words and working out when exactly it happens, and what maybe triggers depersonalization as an experience is a big part of it. And there seems to be this connection between the process of keeping journals and depersonalization. I wonder if this practice of keeping journals in some ways entrenches a depersonalized experience. It seems to do that for Emile, I would say. And Quin is an interesting kind of person to look at in this regard, because what we see with Quin is not keeping diaries of her own depersonalization necessarily, but she does tend to incorporate fictional diaries and journals, as we see in passages and we see in other texts, such as her last unpublished novel, The Unmapped Country. So I think those kinds of questions are things we can start to consider. These maybe larger historical questions are things we can start to consider if we think about Quin in terms of depersonalization and as someone who's part of this tradition of a literary representation of depersonalization. Okay, so that's all I had to say, really. I think there's so many different ways you can enjoy Quin. I think you can just let her words wash over you, as Nonya represented at first. You can pick out all these images, and I think what Arwa picked out was this way in which Quin conjures up a sense of place. And I know I've kind of felt that when I was reading passages last, but it makes me want to go out and kind of do stuff. But I think also this process of looking at Anne Quin's place in this larger literary tradition of depersonalization gives you a slightly different perspective, and it certainly helps me make sense of a text that can be a little bit tricky. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Josh. Furiously scribbling some questions of my own, but we've come to the time for questions to be put to the panelists and for us to discuss some of the questions that have been coming in, which is really, really lovely, Josh, that you just sort of drew everything together to sort of bring the different ways that we've brought Quin to the table, as it were, today. And then hopefully we can continue thinking about some of those things through our discussion. The first question that I thought I would read out, which I thought would follow on quite nicely from your talk potentially, Josh, is a question that asks, that says, I've been wondering about why Quin decided not to name the two characters in passages. What do the panelists think about the effect this has on the way we experience the book? And I wondered if I could put that question to Josh first. I suppose my question to add on to that is whether the kind of naming or the non-naming of the characters connects in any way to some of the things that you've been thinking about for your talk.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, and it's almost, yeah, it's really hard to imagine putting names onto these figures. And I think it really contributes to the effect of the book, the fact that they're not named. It's this emphasis on he and she, and if the kind of disorientation you get of the shift from a first person perspective to the third person doesn't really. It doesn't really work if you've got a individual, a he, and it kind of, I guess it does that in a readerly sense, but you're disorientated and you get to feel that experience of going from the I to the he, I guess going from the I to the Josh Powell, for example, feels quite different to going I to he, because I'm still feeling some sense of myself if I give that name, whereas if it's a he, that you get that impersonal, detached self a lot more, I think. But also, I suppose, and here's where I lose my train of thought. I've completely lost what I was going to say there.
That's all right. I was thinking as you were talking as well that there's something interesting, isn't there, in terms of the way the he and the she sort of set up a kind of oppositional position, and I think in order to kind of deconstruct it or to question it, so those sort of the gendered pronouns, the he and the she, which the I slips into and out of, is kind of interesting in terms of that kind of there's the deliberate, as you say, in a way, depersonalization of the characters. So the characters, we connect with them in a different way because they're not named, but also I think it kind of it enhances the position of the male and the female, that we have them as the he and she, in terms of the way Quin's thinking about objectification, and in terms of the way that she's thinking about how they're kind of their gendered roles in the text, I guess. I mean, I wonder what you think of that question, Arwa, about the characters, because it's a question that was put to all of us, about why the characters aren't named and what the effects of that might be, and whether maybe that has any connection with your thinking about gender.
Well, I have two answers for that question. So my opinion is that they're not named because they're not really the center of the story. So the center of the story is the missing brother, who is an absent third, and they're on a quest to find him. And this is why you have a lot of movement in the text. So they are not named because it's not important. It's not significant to name them. At the same time, I have read accounts that explain the narratives, both narratives, as a schizophrenic account of one character who is reflecting a masculine and feminine side. So that may be one way to look at it. A character that experiences a splitting of mind and self and cannot quite grasp their own sense of self. And then also, both characters can be considered archetypes. So you have the male narrator really obsessed with mythology, Greek mythology especially, and many accounts of the island they're in is similar to Greece. So you have him referencing Medusa, the sirens, and he even calls himself at one point Orpheus. And then the painting that I brought up in my presentation is actually in connection to that, because he, in his side notes, he asks himself, obviously, because the notes are for his own perusal. He asks himself, doesn't the woman recognize that I'm Orpheus? That means that he others her and he sees her as a lesser being, because in the original myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, she's silent, she's mute, she fades out in the background. So they can be seen as archetypes within this whole mythology that he's creating. So instead of giving the actual names, he refers to them, to himself and to the woman through Greek mythology.
And that's really interesting in the way, I suppose I'm always interested in how it feels to me that Quin's drawing upon a kind of avant-garde tradition of using myth as kind of counterpoint, using the kind of archetypes as myth as a kind of counterpoint to the experimentalism in her work. So that's a really interesting range of thoughts on that question. Thanks to you both. I have a question for you, that's specifically for you now, Arwa, if that's okay, which says, I was wondering if the conflicts in the male identity and his search for self can be seen in the visual representation of the edited diary, or are the diary edits more concerned with controlling the female narrator and the narrative? Or are these things interconnected? So the visual representation on the one hand, and the sort of desire to control the narration or the female narrator on the other hand?
I would say they're connected. So the male narrator is on a search for himself, but that search also involves the woman. So she is key to his exploration of himself. But the problem is, as I see it, is that he doesn't really see her or connect with her as a person. He sees her as an archetype. And in many instances, he projects his male anxiety onto her. And then you have dream sequences, I think, really express his male anxiety. So you see him remembering an incident where his mother was sick, and then he brings in the woman into that narrative. And then he brings in his Jewish heritage, and he brings in memories of the Holocaust. So there's a lot of things going on with the male narrator. And the woman here is kind of a tool, I think, where he projects most of his anxiety without really connecting with the woman.
And I suppose in the text itself, the fact that their narratives are sort of kept apart is significant, isn't it? You know, so that they're sort of separated out in those different sections. We move between them. Thanks so much, Arwa. And thank you so much. Questions coming in. This is really brilliant. And I'm just trying to make sure that I keep on top of the questions, because that's one of my roles this evening. So another question that's come in, could Arwa and Josh say something about the representation of inside and outside, internal and external spaces, the room, the beach? And then Arwa, since you related passages to meshes, are these then representative gendered and sex spaces where agency is gained and lost? And how does this relate to inner vision and internalization or depersonalization? So maybe if, you know, we could break those up, because I think that final part of the question perhaps connects to your talk, Josh, doesn't it? So thinking about inside, outside in terms of spaces, the room, the beach, and in terms of gendered or sexed spaces and what might be going on with that. Josh, do you want to start us off on this one, and then we'll come back to Arwa?
Yeah, sure. I think that, yeah, spaces are really interesting. And when I think of Quin's writing, I guess I think of Berg, and it's a pretty long running thing with Quin, is this these kind of partition spaces, this kind of liminality, I guess. Yeah, and it always does always seem to be kind of a way of kind of exploring a psyche, I suppose. But yeah, with particularly depersonalization, I think there's something quite important about what Quin's doing with regards to the schizoid personality. As I was saying, it kind of Quin kind of engages with depersonalization through this idea of a schizoid, and through this kind of pattern of being immersed in something, and being kind of being in a feeling of being in contained, and wanting to feel that, not being kind of part of, not being kind of able to be just on your own, and wanting to be contained within something, and then feeling almost straight away claustrophobic and wanting to get out again, in this constant threshold of being submerged and then wanting to escape. It seems to be a motif that runs through Berg, I think, and I think it runs through the characters in passages. Both, I would say, both voices have this. So I think this pattern, it seems to be very. I think Quin seemed to recognise the kind of pain of this feeling of not being happy inside or out, and needing to alternate between both of those throughout in passages and throughout her texts.
That's really interesting, that idea that either position is uncomfortable once the character's immersed in it, the desire to escape, and then immediately wanting to retreat again, and that feeling of discomfort. And in passages, the sort of dreamlike sequences where the inside seems to open onto the outside, and as you say, that there's a sort of blurring. It's not quite clear whether we're inside or outside. So the sort of thresholds or the boundaries or the barriers aren't always clear either, are they, I suppose, between the inside or the outside. And then the character doesn't quite know where they want to be, because they don't quite know where they are, where they're positioned in that. Thank you, Josh. Arwa, did you want to respond in particular, perhaps, to the kind of part in the question about kind of meshes and whether and how that might connect to this question of space?
That's a very good question. So thank you, Anne. So the external and internal spaces, they are blurred and they are liminal in a sense. But for the woman narrator in passages, the outer spaces represent more freedom, and inner spaces like corridors and train cabins and hotels and bedrooms, they feel very confining to her. And this is where you see her kind of giving you a registry or lists of objects, just kind of taking note. Whereas when she's walking alongside the sea, her immediate instinct is to jump into the sea. And in two instances in the novel, we have the male narrator kind of, taking her away from these open spaces and leading her back to the hotel or the police station or the museum. And he always mentioned, he seems to be upset about her being always outside. So for her, the outside spaces represent an open, free space where she can expand. Her selfhood can expand, where she feels freedom, and she's not closely watched by the male narrator. In meshes, we see this repeated sequence of the key and opening the door and getting, climbing the staircase, getting inside a bedroom, going downstairs again. So this kind of movement within the domestic space is seen as a negative experience by the woman narrator. So it seems kind of confining, especially since you have shots of the sea and you have her running outside often. For those of you who haven't watched the movie, there's a lot of movement outside, but inside she seems very confined and she goes around in circles. So here the inner spaces are kind of domesticized. They're considered to be feminine spaces where the women are pushed into, whereas the open spaces are considered to be more natural and more comforting.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, especially in terms of your point about the sea there. We had another question about the sea. Could you say a bit more about the coastal setting in Quin and why you think it is such a powerful image for her? I notice often the movement of water, rivers, storms, swimming pool, ice, something that Quin uses. And wonder if you have any thoughts about, I suppose, the significance or the symbolism of water in her writing.
Who would like to go first?
I wondered if Arwa, would you mind going first, and then I could come in, and Josh might have some thoughts on water as well.
Yes. So the sea and the ocean symbolize death, and they symbolize mystery as well. So I think here, when you have the sea presented in this way, it's also a reflection of the woman's subjectivity and its fluctuation. It's not just a natural setting for them. It represents freedom from the inner confines of the body as well. So it opens up a spiritual connection. It opens up an otherworldly connection as well, because you see the woman narrator in passages getting out of her body and getting out of her head just to experience the serenity of the ocean. And like I mentioned before, her instinct is to jump into the sea. And throughout, I think, many images throughout Western culture, you have Ophelia in the water, you have the birth of Venus, and you have all of these water elements that seem the Lady of Shalott as well. So Josh might be familiar with that one. So you do have water being a means of escape for women characters throughout literature and art.
It's so interesting, though, that idea of water as escape, isn't it? Because I was thinking as you were talking, Arwa, that of course, Berg is set at a seaside location, possibly Brighton. In 3, the young woman S, is found kind of drowned at sea. And you mentioned the Lady of Shalott. So we have sort of the water as escape, but that kind of method of escape is sometimes through death. And of course, Quin's own death in the water. There's a sort of thread of water as a kind of sanctuary, but also as this kind of dangerous space, potentially, I was thinking, for Quin. It made me think of how important Virginia Woolf was for Quin. So Quin was very influenced by Woolf's book, The Waves. It was one of her favorite texts. And of course, The Waves works with the kind of metaphor of the movement of the sea, although it's about the shifting perspectives. And I think there are some similarities to passages in terms of that wave-like motion that you described, Arwa, of the woman's passages as kind of performing that motion. And so I hadn't perhaps thought so much about it until you were talking of all those kind of through lines about kind of representations of women in the water, and the way that the water emerges again and again, or the sea emerges again and again in Quin's writing, and how important the sea is, and the idea of the sea in waves for a writer like Woolf, who Quin was very interested in. Josh, I wondered if you had any more thoughts on Quin and the sea.
Yeah, I think so. I think the sea represents kind of freedom. I can see that, but I think thinking about it also represents a kind of loss of self into the other, and it represents the other a kind of desire to escape from self in Quin often, and be just part of this larger thing of otherness. And of course, the kind of metaphor is that when you kind of dive into the sea and try to lose self and become otherness, this process, you got this kind of unconscious bodily urge to get out of it again, and you feel like you're drowning because you are drowning. And Quin is often playing with this how far can you push out into the sea and be kind of submerged into otherness before you want to, and you need to get out again and stand as a self and exist as an individual consciousness. And I think that's that tends to be what I read with Quin, and it ties to object relations psychoanalysis often, because this is talked about in terms of the sea often, and the schizoid personality is often talked about as an individual who needs to be part of the sea, part of the other, often gets engulfed in the other, but then as soon as they get engulfed, they react badly and want to escape from the other almost as soon as they do that. And I think the sea acts as a kind of metaphor for that often.
That's so interesting. I suppose in terms of thinking of the depths of the sea in relation to that, thinking about the psyche and the other, is another kind of way, I guess, that Quin's drawing on psychoanalysis, but also obviously, I suppose, on kind of modernist writers, and they're emerging, I suppose. Some of those ideas are emerging at similar times, which is really interesting. Just thinking about Quin's, I think there was another question about the relationship between passages and kind of historical or political contexts. So the question is about the totalitarian context of passages, the dictatorship with its disappearances, rumors of torture and murder. What's the relationship between that context and the two characters? The sort of focus on these two kind of individuals in the text. I wonder, Josh, do you have any thoughts about what's going on with that context and how it relates to the individuals in the text?
Yeah, I mean, it does perplex me a little bit. It feels a little bit off to when I'm reading it sometimes, but when you think about it, it does kind of fit. Particularly with some of the things Arwa's been saying about this kind of totalitarian personality that you're getting in the male protagonist, particularly in this kind of controlling figure. It does seem to be a kind of branch off of or a reflection of perhaps a personality type that Quin is exploring in the voice of the male protagonist. That would be my thought on it, but I admit it is something that does perplex me when I'm reading it, and seems to jut out at me a little bit.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Josh. Arwa, did you want to respond to Josh or have any other thoughts?
Yes. So I do agree that with Josh, and that it is related to how Quin portrays the male narrator. So I definitely think that having that very unstable and totalitarian background brings out the worst in the male narrator. So you see him actually raping women, engaging in sadomasochist encounters, wearing a robe and calling himself a high priest. And then in many instances in the text, he's saying, I am mad. Something is bringing out the madness in me. And that's something I think is that political climate, the fact that they are detained by authorities, the fact that there isn't much help offered to them, the fact that, this trauma of the missing brother and gunshots, and it's all very triggering because it also reminds him of his cultural trauma, his childhood. All of these negative experiences kind of come and surface through his dreams, actually, to express his kind of panic.
That's really interesting. So that sort of wider background of the kind of political context and how actually that kind of works to reflect back on the male character. Well, I can't see you, frozen for me, but can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much to you both for answering that. I'm very mindful of time and that I need to finish things, to wrap things up by 8:30. But there is another question that's come in, and I wonder if we might have time to think a little bit about it before we finish. So this question is about the connection. Is there any connection, or do you see any connection with post-war drug culture in these breakups of personality and identity and the fragmenting of writing itself? Maybe if we go to you first with that one, Josh.
Sorry, I was having some trouble unmuting there. Yeah, I mean, it seems like it. I've never investigated that in much detail, but yeah, I mean, it seems steeped in kind of experiments with drugs, and psychotropic drugs are kind of one of these things that are known to produce experience of depersonalization in pleasurable and unpleasurable ways. Yeah, exactly where it comes into Quin and exactly kind of how she used drugs. I'd like to know. Whether there are kind of records of that and that aspect of her life. I'd be really interested in knowing exactly how that kind of experimentation happened. It obviously did, but I'm not too sure how it did. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'll just come in there quickly, if that's okay, as a direct response, that there are some really interesting. So when Quin was living in New Mexico, and experimenting with drugs, there are some sort of accounts of those experiences, you know, sort of, I suppose, a diary of that experience. She was very interested in writing down exactly what it felt like to have those kinds of experiences, and you know, accounts of hallucinations, but also accounts of you know, kind of out of body experiences or depersonalized experiences. And some of that material was material that she's kind of later worked with, certainly in some of the short fiction coming out at a kind of similar time, or just around the time that she's writing Passages, quite a lot of short fiction that seems quite directly connected with some of the kind of letters and diary entries that I've seen of hers that are thinking about the relationship between her writing and those experiences in quite an explicit way. I've talked us to 8:30, so I'm really sorry if you wanted to come in, Arwa, but I'm mindful that Anna asked me to be really tight on time. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you both about Quin. I don't have that many experiences at the moment to talk with other people who have such fascinating insights into her work. And although I've been working on Quin for a really long time, I always come away with sort of new ideas and new perspectives just hearing other people talking about her work. So thanks very much from me, but I'm going to hand over to you now, Anna.
Thanks, Nonia. And just a few words from me to close the evening, starting with a huge thank you. And I think it's safe to say we're all applauding you three from behind our screens, even if you can't hear us, for such a wonderful selection of talks. And thank you, Nonia, Arwa, and Josh, for this really, really revealing panel of presentations, and also that really stimulating discussion, revealing a lot about the dreamlike sequences of Quin's writing. And I think if you haven't tried reading her work yet, I'm sure you'll want to now. I'm going to definitely look more into what scholars have said about Quin's creative process. I thought it was really fascinating what you said there at the end, Nonia, about how maybe she was writing about her own experiences and how that transmuted into her fiction. Great, so much to think about. Thank you also to our audience. Thank you for submitting your questions and for listening to the talks this evening. You should look out for an email from Cardiff BookTalk following tonight with a feedback survey. It's only a short survey, but if you don't mind filling it in, we'd love to hear what you thought of tonight.